The silence in the North Cascades wasn't actually silent. Maya Vance had learned that during her first winter as a senior park ranger. If you listened closely enough, past the whistling of the wind through the hemlocks and the rhythmic crunch of your own boots on frozen pine needles, you could hear the mountains breathing. It was a cold, indifferent breath that didn't care about the medals she had tucked away in a shoebox or the ghosts that followed her back from 3 tours in the Middle East. Maya stopped, her breath hitching in the frigid air, forming a silver mist against her face. She adjusted the strap of her pack. At 34, her body felt the echoes of her service, a dull ache in her left knee from a jump that went sideways in Kandahar. A stiffness in her shoulders that no amount of mountain air could quite dissolve. But she preferred this pain. It was physical. It was honest. She looked out over the jagged peaks of the Cascades. For 2 years, this had been her sanctuary. As an Army MP, she had spent a decade looking into the darkest corners of human nature. Now, she looked at trees. Trees didn't lie. "Ranger Vance to base," she said, tapping her shoulder mic. "I'm at the 7-mile marker on the Devil's Backbone Trail. All clear. Just checking the North Ridge before the storm rolls in." "Copy that, Maya," the voice of Ben, the veteran dispatcher, crackled back. "Don't stay up there too long. The National Weather Service is calling for a whiteout by sunset. You know how those ridges get. I'll be down in an hour." "Ben, Vance out." She clipped the mic back. She was lying, and she knew it. She wasn't ready to go back to the small, heated cabin and the flickering TV. When she was alone in the high country, the memories of the Humvees and the dust stayed quiet. She turned a sharp corner where the trail hugged a granite cliff face. And that's when she smelled it. It wasn't the smell of wood smoke or a forest fire. It was a sharp, chemical tang, the scent of burning kerosene and melting composite. High-octane fuel. Maya's instinct flipped like a switch. The civilian ranger vanished, and the investigator returned. Her heart rate didn't spike, it settled into a slow, tactical rhythm. She moved off the trail, navigating the dense underbrush with the practiced stealth of a woman who had hunted men through urban ruins. 10 minutes later, she saw it. A gash had been torn through the canopy. Ancient fir trees had been snapped like toothpicks. At the center of a smoking crater lay the carcass of a plane. But it wasn't a bush plane or weekend Cessna. It was sleek, painted in a matte gray, non-reflective finish that seemed to swallow the light. There were no registration numbers on the tail. "What are you doing way up here?" she whispered. The wreckage was still hot. Small flickers of blue flame danced on the edges of the fuselage. Maya moved closer, her hand instinctively reaching for the sidearm she carried, a standard-issue Glock 19. She didn't draw it, but the weight of it was a comfort. The cockpit was pulverized. No one could have survived that impact. But as she circled the debris, she noticed something that sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the wind. The emergency exit door hadn't been blown off by the crash. It had been opened from the inside. Maya knelt by the door, which lay 20 feet away in the snow. There were footprints, not the heavy, clumsy boots of a pilot, but the precise, treaded patterns of tactical footwear. Vibram soles, the same kind she used to wear. She followed the prints for a few yards until she found the body. He wasn't in the plane. He was slumped against a cedar tree, 50 yards from the crash. He was dressed in a high-end charcoal suit that looked absurdly out of place in the wilderness. He was young, maybe late 20s, with the soft hands of someone who spent his days behind a desk. He was also clutching a silver briefcase handcuffed to his wrist. "Hey," Maya called out softly, keeping her distance. "I'm a park ranger. Can you hear me?" The man didn't move. Maya approached and checked for a pulse. Cold. He had died recently. But not from the crash. She pulled back his jacket and saw the small, dark hole in the center of his chest. A single shot. Professional. A 9mm hollow point, by the looks of the exit wound. This wasn't an accident, Maya muttered, her blood turning to ice. She looked back at the plane. If this man had been shot, the shooter was either on that plane or waiting for it. She reached for her radio to call Ben, to call the sheriff, to call anyone, but as she touched the dial, a low, rhythmic thrumming began to vibrate in her chest. It was the sound of a helicopter. But it wasn't a rescue bird. There were no bright colors. No sirens. It was a blacked-out MH6 little bird, flying low, hugging the contour of the ridge to stay below radar. It was coming from the north. Maya dove behind a fallen log just as the helicopter cleared the ridge. It hovered over the crash site, its rotors kicking up a blinding cloud of snow and ash. Two figures rappelled down, fast roping with a precision that screamed special operations. They were dressed in slate gray tactical gear, carrying suppressed submachine guns. They didn't look like rescuers. They looked like cleaners. Maya watched through the gap in the logs. One of the men moved straight to the dead man in the suit. He didn't check for a pulse. He pulled a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters from his vest and nipped the man's wrist, taking the briefcase and leaving the hand behind. Target secured. A voice came over a radio, clear enough for Maya to hear in the thin air. "Checking for the witness now. The transponder says there was a ranger ping in this sector 2 minutes ago." Maya's breath caught. The radio, her periodic check-in with Ben, had broadcasted her GPS coordinates. "Find her," the voice on the radio commanded. "Leave no trace." Maya knew exactly what that meant. In her old life, leaving no trace meant total erasure. She looked at the mountain behind her. The storm was closing in, the sky turning a bruised purple. She had no rifle, no backup, and 40 miles of wilderness between her and the nearest town. But she also knew these mountains better than they ever would. She didn't run immediately. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, jagged piece of the plane's wreckage she had picked up, a charred microchip housing. She tucked it deep into her inner pocket. One of the gray-clad men turned his head toward her hiding spot. The sun caught the lens of his night vision goggles. Maya Vance didn't feel the ache in her knee anymore. The ghost of Kandahar wasn't behind her anymore, it was inside her. She slowly backed away into the shadows of the hemlocks, disappearing into the whiteout just as the first bullet hissed through the air where her head had been a second before. The hunt had begun, but the men in the helicopter had made one fatal mistake. They thought they were the predators. They didn't realize they had just stepped into Maya Vance's backyard. And in these mountains, the silence could kill you just as fast as a bullet. The bullet didn't crack the air, it hissed. A suppressed whisper that ended in the wet thwack of lead burying itself into the ancient cedar bark inches from Maya's ear. Wood shrapnel stung her cheek, drawing a thin line of heat in the freezing cold. She didn't scream. She didn't even gasp. Maya Vance was already moving. She dropped low, sliding down a steep, snow-covered embankment. The world turned into a blur of white and gray as she tumbled through the underbrush, using her momentum to gain distance. She hit a flat shelf of rock 50 feet below, rolled, and came up in a crouch behind a massive glacial erratic, a boulder left behind by a dying ice age. Above her, the rhythmic thrum-thrum-thrum of the little bird helicopter was fading, suppressed by the rising howl of the wind. The storm was her only ally now. The white-out Ben had warned her about was rolling in like a heavy curtain of static, erasing the horizon and muffling sound. Sector 2, we have movement. A voice echoed from the ridge above. It was flat, devoid of emotion, the voice of a professional doing a job. Target is heading west toward the ravine. Engaging. Maya leaned her back against the cold stone, her chest heaving, but her eyes were sharp. Scanning the tree line, she checked her gear. A Glock 19 with 2 spare magazines. A ruggedized radio. A multi-tool. A survival kit. Against 2, possibly more, highly trained contractors with night vision and suppressed submachine guns. She was outgunned. But you aren't outthought. She reminded herself. They have the tech, you have the dirt. She pulled her white winter camouflage poncho from her pack. In the army, they called it ghosting. She threw it over her ranger uniform, the mottled white and gray blending perfectly with the swirling snow. She became a shape without an edge. She watched the ridge. 2 figures emerged from the mist. They moved with high-ready precision, their boots crunching softly on the crust of the snow. They were using thermal imagers. She could see the faint glow of the screens near their eyes. They can see heat, Maya whispered to herself. She looked at her hands. Her body was a glowing beacon of 98 degrees in a world that was rapidly dropping toward zero. If she stayed here, they'd pick her up like a flare in a dark room. She looked down the slope. 100 yards away, the Devil's Throat Creek ran through a narrow gorge. The water was glacial, barely above freezing, fed by the high-altitude runoff. It was dangerous, fast-moving, and exactly what she needed. Maya moved. She didn't run, she flowed. She kept low to the ground, moving between the shadows of the hemlocks. Every time she stepped, she placed her foot in the hollows of the roots where the snow was thinnest, leaving no deep tracks for them to follow. Behind her, a flare hissed into the sky, casting a ghoulish green light over the woods. They were trying to flush her out. She reached the creek. The water was black and violent, churning over jagged rocks. Maya didn't hesitate. She stepped into the water, the cold hitting her like a physical blow to the heart. Her breath caught in her throat, her lungs seizing. She forced herself to move deeper, until she was waist-deep, tucked under an overhanging shelf of ice and rock. The water would mask her heat signature. To their thermal goggles, she would look like just another patch of freezing mountain runoff. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Her legs went numb. Her teeth began to chatter. A rhythmic clicking. She had to clench her jaw to stop. Then, she heard them. The crunch of boots on the bank above her. Lost her, one of the men said. His voice was right above her head. Thermal is washing out. The creek is too hot. No. Wait. The creek is too cold. It's creating a blind spot. She's a ranger. The second voice replied. This one was deeper, older, or she was something else before she wore the badge. Nobody moves like that unless they've been hunted before. Orders are to recover the chip and terminate the witness. The client doesn't want any hero stories in the morning news. Maya held her breath, her fingers gripped around the grip of her Glock. She was tempted to pop up and take them both. 2 shots. Fast, but they had body armor. And she was shivering. In a gunfight, the one who shivers loses. She waited. She probably headed for the ranger station. The older one said, "Let's leapfrog ahead. We'll catch her at the trailhead." The sound of their footsteps receded, moving west. Maya waited another 3 minutes before she dragged herself out of the water. She collapsed on the bank, her body shaking violently. This was stage 1 hypothermia. If she didn't get dry and get moving, the mountain would finish the job the cleaners started. She stripped off her wet outer layers with trembling hands, reaching into her pack for her emergency thermal blanket, a thin, crinkly sheet of mylar. She wrapped it under her dry fleece, trapping what little body heat she had left. She took out the charred microchip housing she had scavenged from the wreck. Even in the dim, green light of the fading flare, she could see the logo etched into the blackened metal. It wasn't a government seal. It was a stylized the logo for Ethelgard Dynamics, a private defense contractor that specialized in autonomous weapons and AI-driven surveillance. "What were you doing in my woods, Ethelgard?" she whispered. She realized then that she couldn't go to the ranger station. If these men knew who she was, they'd be waiting there. They probably had Ben held at gunpoint, or worse. The thought of Ben, a 60-year-old grandfather who liked to bake lemon bars for the staff, being caught in this crossfire made her blood boil. She had to go off-grid. Maya looked up at the peaks. There was an old fire lookout tower on Blackcap Mountain, 3 miles up the steepest grade in the park. It had been abandoned since the 70s. No power, no heat, and most importantly, no GPS signature on any modern map. It was a suicide trek in a blizzard. "Perfect," Maya muttered. She stood up, her joints popping like small caliber fire. She checked her magazine one last time. "Let's see how you boys handle the high country." As she turned to begin the climb, she saw a light flicker in the distance. Near the crash site, not a flare, but a steady, powerful beam. They were bringing in heavy equipment. They weren't just cleaning the site, they were erasing it. She turned her back on the light and vanished into the whiteout. A ghost returning to the shadows. The climb up Blackcap Mountain was a slow-motion suicide mission. The wind didn't just blow, it screamed. A high-pitched, banshee wail that tore at the fabric of Maya's parka and threatened to pull the heat right out of her bones. Every step was a battle. The snow was waist-deep in the drifts, heavy and wet, clinging to her legs like lead weights. Maya's lungs burned. At 7,000 feet, the air was thin and tasted like needles. Left foot, breathe. Right foot, breathe. She was hallucinating. For a moment, the white expanse of the Cascades shifted, turning into the sun-bleached dust of the Helmand province. She could almost hear the low hum of a diesel engine and the smell of stale coffee in an armored cabin. She saw the face of her old partner, Miller, grinning at her through a layer of grit. "Stay awake, Vance," Miller's ghost whispered in her ear. "The cold is just a lie the body tells you when it wants to quit." Maya blinked, shaking her head. Miller had been gone for 6 years. The dust was gone. There was only the ice. She reached the summit ridge where the trees gave way to bare, jagged rock. Perched on the very edge of the precipice sat the Blackcap Lookout, a square, wooden box on stilts, wrapped in windows that had long ago been frosted opaque by decades of storms. It looked like a lonely ghost guarding the graveyard of the world. Maya climbed the wooden stairs, her frozen fingers fumbling with the railing. The wood groaned under her weight, sounding like a ship breaking apart at sea. She reached the door, which was secured with a heavy, rusted padlock. She didn't have the key. She didn't need one. She pulled her multi-tool from her belt and jammed the screwdriver head into the hasp. With a sharp, practiced twist of her shoulder, the rotted wood gave way. She ducked inside and slammed the door shut, throwing the manual bolt. The silence hit her like a physical weight. Inside, the wind was reduced to a dull roar against the glass. The air was stale, smelling of old cedar and mouse droppings. But it was still. Maya collapsed against the door, sliding down until her butt hit the floor. She wrapped her arms around her knees and just breathed, her body shaking so hard the floorboards rattled. She waited for 5 minutes, letting her heart rate drop. Then, she went to work. She moved through the dark room with a flashlight shielded by her fingers. Casting only a tiny sliver of light, she found what she was looking for in a corner locker. A stash of emergency supplies she'd hiked up here herself 6 months ago, just in case a hiker got stranded. She stripped off her damp clothes. Her skin blew white in the moonlight. She rubbed herself raw with a dried towel until her blood started flowing again. Then pulled on a thick wool sweater and heavy canvas pants. She felt human again. Barely. Maya sat at the center observer's desk. The Osborne Firefinder, a large circular map tool, sitting like an altar in the middle of the room. She pulled out the charred microchip housing. Using the fine tweezers on her multi-tool, she pried open the casing. Inside wasn't just a chip. It was a high-capacity solid-state drive, wrapped in a heat-shielded polymer. There was a small LED on the side. She pressed a recessed button. The LED blinked 3 times. "Amber. Encrypted," she whispered, "and it's still broadcasting a low-frequency ping." A cold spike of adrenaline shot through her. If it was broadcasting, they were tracking it. They weren't just following her tracks in the snow. They were following the signal in her pocket. She looked out the windows. The storm was thick, but for a split second, the wind shifted, clearing a path in the clouds. Down in the valley, she saw it. A single, white light, moving fast. They were coming up the service road on snowmobiles. High-output engines. They'd be at the base of the ridge in 20 minutes. Maya moved to the old radio console in the corner. It was a relic from the 1970s. A vacuum tube beast that hadn't seen power in 40 years. But she knew this tower had a backup, a hand-cranked emergency generator tucked under the floorboards. She knelt and pulled up the hatch. But her hand stopped midair. There were fresh scuff marks on the generator's casing. Maya's hand went to her Glock. She didn't draw it. She didn't want the click of the holster to give her away. She held her breath, listening. Under the sound of the wind, there was another noise, a soft, rhythmic rasping. It was the sound of someone breathing. Maya spun, drawing her weapon and leveling it at the dark space beneath the heavy wooden bunk beds in the corner. "Come out, now," she commanded, her voice like iron. "Hands where I can see them, or I start punching holes." There was a frantic scramble. A figure rolled out from under the bunk. Hands held high, palms out. It was a man, thin and shivering, wearing a flight suit that was stained with oil and blood. He looked terrified, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "Don't shoot, please, don't shoot," he stammered. Maya didn't lower the gun. "Who are you? Were you on that plane?" The man nodded frantically. I'm David Vane. I was the co-pilot. I jumped when the internal security started shooting. I had to shoot. I didn't think I'd make it." Maya squinted. He looked like he was telling the truth. But in her world, looking like the truth was the easiest way to get killed. Internal security? You mean the men in the gray gear? Aethelgard, David whispered, his voice cracking. They weren't security. They were a hit team. They wanted the drive. The man in the suit, the courier, he tried to lock the system. And they opened fire at 30,000 feet. Maya lowered the gun an inch. But her thumb stayed on the safety. They're coming. David, right now. They've got snowmobiles and they're tracking this drive. David's face went pale. We have to get rid of it. If they find us with that, they won't just kill us. They'll make us disappear. That drive, it's not just data. It's the source code for the Hades protocol. It's an autonomous targeting AI that doesn't need a human in the loop. It's illegal under every international treaty. Maya looked at the small, blinking amber light. This wasn't just a plane crash. This was a war crime in a box. I can't get a signal out with the storm, Maya said, her mind racing. But this tower has a lightning rod. And I have a radio that needs power. She looked at the co-pilot. David, I need you to start cranking that generator. I'm going to try to boost a signal to the regional FAA tower. If we can get a Mayday out with the Aethelgard signature, they might hesitate to kill us. And if they don't? David asked, his voice trembling. Maya looked out the window. The snowmobiles were closer now, their twin headlamps cutting through the dark like the eyes of a predator. Then we make sure they don't leave this mountain, Maya said. She reached into her pack and pulled out a roll of climbing rope and a flare gun. I've spent 10 years cleaning up other people's messes. I'm not letting them mess up my woods. She looked at the co-pilot, her eyes softening for just a fraction of a second. Do you trust me, David? The young man looked at the ranger, her face scarred by the wind. Her eyes steady as a mountain, and he nodded. Good, Maya said, her voice dropping into a low, tactical hum, because things are about to get very loud. The rhythmic grind whir of the hand-cranked generator was the only sound in the tower besides the screaming wind. David was sweating despite the sub-zero temperatures, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he turned the iron handle. Keep going, David, Maya whispered, her eyes pressed to a pair of weathered binoculars. The tubes need to warm up. We only get one shot at this. Below, the twin beams of the snowmobiles had stopped at the base of the final ridge. The terrain was too steep for the machines now. The cleaners would be on foot, using crampons and tactical climbing gear. They were professionals, they wouldn't rush. They would flank the tower. One from the north, one from the east, trying to create a crossfire. Maya, the light, David panted, pointing to the radio console. A faint, amber glow flickered behind the glass of the old signal meter. The needle jumped. Got it, Maya said. She stepped to the console, her fingers dancing over the dials with a memory she hadn't tapped into since her days at Fort Leonard Wood. She keyed the heavy mic. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Ranger Maya Vance at Blackcap Lookout. I have a downed aircraft survivor and a recovered Aethelgard data drive. I am under fire by unidentified hostile PMCs. Does anyone copy? Over. Static. A wall of white noise that sounded like the ocean. The storm is bouncing the signal. David groaned. It's a localized Faraday cage with all this sleet. Wait, Maya muttered. She adjusted the frequency, cutting through the interference. Vance? Maya, is that you? It was Ben, but his voice sounded wrong. It wasn't the warm, grandfatherly tone from the morning check-in. It was tight, strained, the sound of a man with a gun pressed to his ribs. Ben, I need you to patch this through to the state police and the FAA. Tell them I have the Hades Protocol. Do you hear me? The Hades Protocol. There was a long silence on the other end. Then, a new voice broke the squelch. A cold, cultured voice that sounded like silk sliding over a blade. Ranger Vance, or should I say, Sergeant Vance? We've been reading your file. Impressive service record. It's a shame to see such a decorated career end in a tragic mountain accident. Maya's grip tightened on the mic. Who is this? A friend of the bottom line. Sergeant, you have something that doesn't belong to you. The drive is proprietary Aethelgard property. Hand it over to the team outside. And we might let the co-pilot live. As for you, well, we can negotiate a disappearance that doesn't involve a body. You're at the station, Maya realized, her heart sinking. You have Ben. Ben is fine. For now. He's telling me all about your favorite fishing spots. But my patience is shorter than this radio's range. You have 3 minutes before my cleaners breach that glass box you call a fortress. The radio went dead. They have the station, David whispered, his face ghostly in the amber light. They've cut us off. Not yet, Maya said. She looked at the drive. The amber light was still blinking. Ping, ping, ping. She looked at the ceiling of the lookout, the massive lightning rod assembly that channeled the cascade's frequent strikes into the ground. Then she looked at the heavy-duty battery cables connected to the generator. David, stop cranking, she ordered. We're changing the plan. What are you doing? I can't send a voice message. But I can send a flare, Maya said. Her voice was calm now, the icy, detached calm of a soldier who had accepted the odds. I'm going to bridge the generator power directly into the lightning rod's grounding wire. If I can surge the drive's transponder, it'll blow a signal so loud every SATCOM in the northern hemisphere will see a high-priority distress ping coming from this peak. It'll fry the drive, David cried. The drive is the bait. I've already pulled the microchip housing with the physical serial numbers. That's all the evidence the DOJ needs. Maya grabbed a roll of copper wire from her kit. She worked with frantic precision, stripping the ends with her teeth. She could hear the faint clink of metal on stone outside. They were on the stairs. Get down, David, under the desk. Crack. The north window shattered. A high-velocity round whistled through the room, smashing the Osborne firefinder into 1,000 brass shards. Maya didn't flinch. She jammed the copper wire into the generator lead and threw the other end over the grounding rod. Now, David, crank it like your life depends on it. Because it does. David lunged for the handle, spinning it with a manic strength. The generator began to whine, a high-pitched scream that vibrated the floorboards. Maya pulled her Glock and fired 3 shots through the shattered window, suppressing the shooter on the ridge. She didn't expect to hit him in this wind. She just needed him to keep his head down. The door burst open. A man in slate-gray tactical gear kicked his way in, his submachine gun raised. The muzzle flash lit up the room like a strobe light. Maya rolled left, the bullets shredding the wooden bunk bed where she had been standing seconds ago. She fired from the floor, 2 shots to the center mass. The man's body armor soaked up the rounds, but the force knocked him backward onto the narrow catwalk. The wire. Maya, it's glowing, David yelled. The copper wire was turning a bright, angry orange. The drive, strapped to the grounding rod, began to hiss. Boom! A massive surge of blue electricity arched from the generator to the rod. For a split second, The entire lookout tower was bathed in a blinding, ethereal light. The drive didn't just fry, it detonated in a shower of white sparks, sending a massive electromagnetic pulse straight up the lightning rod and into the storm clouds. On the radio, 100 voices suddenly screamed to life: static, emergency channels, air traffic control, all triggered by the massive signal surge. The second, cleaner, stepped into the doorway. His goggles cracked, his face a mask of fury. He leveled his weapon at Maya. Too late, Maya hissed. She didn't use her gun. She grabbed the heavy, iron-bound logbook from the desk and hurled it at his face. Then lunged. She caught him in the throat with her shoulder, sending both of them plummeting through the open door and out onto the icy catwalk. They hit the railing hard. The rotted wood groaned and snapped. Maya grabbed the man's tactical vest, her fingers locking into the mall webbing. She swung her weight around, using the man's own momentum. He screamed as he tumbled over the edge, disappearing into the white abyss of the cliffside. Maya clung to the edge of the broken railing, her legs dangling over a 500-foot drop. Her fingers were screaming, the cold biting through her gloves. Maya, David's hand appeared, grabbing her wrist. He hauled her back up onto the deck. They both lay there, gasping for air, the snow falling over them like a shroud. Down in the valley, the sky was no longer just black and white. Far to the south, the blue and red strobe lights of a dozen state patrol vehicles were winding their way up the mountain pass. The EMP had worked. The black box had screamed. And the world had answered. But as Maya looked at the radio console, she saw a single light still blinking. Not the drive, not the generator. It was her shoulder mic. It had been recording the whole time. "I have the evidence," she whispered to the empty air, her voice cracking with the first hint of emotion since the crash. "Miller, I finally got the evidence." But the shadows weren't finished with her yet. In the distance, the black Little Bird helicopter was returning. And this time, it wasn't coming for a cleanup. It was coming for a war. The glass didn't just break this time, it disintegrated. The BRAAP of AM-134 minigun shredded the lookout tower's upper floor in a 3-second burst of lead and splinters. The black Little Bird was hovering just 50 yards off the cliffside. Its nose tilted down like a predatory wasp. "Jump, David, jump now," Maya screamed over the roar of the rotors. She didn't wait for him to process. She grabbed the co-pilot by the harness of his flight suit and threw both of them through the jagged gap where the west wall used to be. They didn't fall into the abyss. Maya had timed it. They slammed into a 10-foot drift of soft powder piled against the lee side of the ridge. The snow swallowed them whole. Above, the lookout tower erupted into a fireball as the helicopter's thermal cannons ignited the remaining fuel in the emergency generator. The wooden structure, Maya's sanctuary, collapsed in a rain of burning cedar. Maya clawed her way out of the drift, her lungs gasping for oxygen that felt like liquid nitrogen. She dragged David out by his collar. He was coughing, eyes wide with the hollow stare of the shell-shocked. "Move," she hissed, pulling him toward a dark slit in the granite face of the mountain. "If we stay on the surface, they'll pick us off with infrared in 30 seconds. They scrambled into the cathedral, a network of ancient lava tubes and glacial ice caves that honeycombed the Blackcap Massif. It was a place rangers usually avoided during storms, a labyrinth where the temperature stayed a constant. killing 30 degrees, and the silence was heavy enough to crush a man's spirit. Inside, the roar of the helicopter faded to a low, rhythmic vibration that pulsed through the rock. Maya clicked on her small tactical light, keeping it shielded. The walls were translucent blue, jagged ribs of ice hanging from the ceiling like the teeth of a frozen leviathan. They blew it up," David whispered, leaning against a wall of frost. "They just erased a federal building. They don't care about the law. David, they're protecting a billion-dollar algorithm," Maya said. She knelt, checking her Glock. She had 5 rounds left in the current magazine and 1 spare. 6 bullets to finish a war. She felt a sharp, familiar throb in her left knee. She looked down and saw a dark stain on her canvas pants. A piece of shrapnel from the tower had sliced her deep. "You're bleeding," David said, his voice trembling. "I've had worse," Maya lied. She took a roll of duct tape from her pack and wrapped it tightly over the fabric, cinching the wound shut. "Listen to me. There's an exit 300 yards deeper, leading to the old mining trail. If we can reach the tree line, the state patrol will find us." She paused, her eyes drifting to the dark tunnel ahead. The silence of the cave brought back the one memory she had spent 2 years trying to bury. "My partner, Miller. He died because of a glitch in a drone's targeting system," she said softly, her voice echoing off the ice. "Ethelgard was the contractor. They called it acceptable collateral damage. I spent 3 years trying to prove the AI had malfunctioned, that it had targeted a civilian hospital on purpose to test its lethality parameters. They buried the evidence, destroyed my career, and sent me here to rot in the woods." She looked at the microchip housing in her hand. "This isn't just a mission, David. This is the truth Miller died for. And I am not letting them bury it again." David looked at her, and for the first time, the fear in his eyes was replaced by a grim, reflected resolve. "Then we keep moving." They pushed deeper into the blue gloom. The air grew thinner, the passage narrowing until they were forced to crawl. The ice groaned above them, the weight of the entire mountain shifting under the weight of the blizzard. Clink. The sound was tiny, a metallic tap against stone. It wasn't the mountain. Maya froze. She signaled David to stay flat. She killed her light. Total darkness swallowed them. In the void, Maya's other senses sharpened. She smelled the tang of gun oil and the faint, artificial scent of a chemical hand warmer. They weren't alone in the cathedral. "I know you're in here, Sergeant Vance." A voice drifted through the tunnel. It was the man from the radio, the leader. He sounded close, his voice bouncing off the ice so it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You're a tracker. You know how this ends. You're trapped in a bottle. And I'm the one holding the cork." Maya didn't breathe. She reached into her pack and pulled out her last flare, a handheld magnesium stick. "You're a long way from a boardroom, Ethelgard," Maya called out, her voice steady. She moved silently to the left, putting a pillar of ice between her and the sound of his voice. "I'm a fixer," the man replied. A tactical light flicked on, cutting through the dark like a blade. It was 100 yards away, sweeping the cavern. "And you were a very expensive loose end. Give me the chip, and I'll let the boy walk. I'll even tell the recovery team you died a hero." "I've heard that one before," Maya whispered to herself. She looked at David and pointed toward a small crevice in the floor. "Stay." Maya stood up. She didn't hide. She stepped into the center of the cavern, the faint light of the assassin's beam catching the reflective trim on her ranger jacket. I'm right here, she shouted. The light snapped onto her. The assassin emerged from the shadows. His submachine gun leveled at her chest. He was alone, the last of his team. His slate gray gear was torn, and his face was smeared with blood and soot. He looked like a demon birthed from the ice. End of the road, Ranger, he said, his finger tightening on the trigger. Not quite, Maya said. She didn't draw her gun. She struck the magnesium flare against the ice wall. The cavern erupted in a blinding, white-hot glare of 3,000 degrees. In the reflective, crystalline environment of the ice cave, the light didn't just shine, it multiplied. The entire room became a hall of mirrors. 1,000 suns screaming into the assassin's night vision goggles. The man screamed, clutching his eyes as the high-intensity light burned through his retinas. Amplified by his electronics, he fired wildly, the bullets ricocheting off the ice like angry hornets. Maya didn't waste a second. She didn't shoot. She lunged forward, sliding across the slick floor, and tackled him at the waist. They hit the ice hard. Maya swung a heavy, gloved fist, connecting with his jaw. He swung back, his combat knife sliding from its sheath. The blade hissed through the air, slicing Maya's shoulder, but she didn't flinch. She grabbed his wrist, twisted it with the leverage of a woman who had trained for 1,000 such fights, and slammed his hand against a jagged ice shelf. The knife clattered away. Maya pinned him, her forearm across his throat. She pulled the Glock and pressed the cold muzzle against his temple. "Who gave the order?" she hissed. "Give me a name, or you stay in this ice until the next glacier moves." The man gasped for air, his eyes unseeing, weeping red from the flare's burn. "Vogel, CEO, Aethelgard, it's already uploaded." "Not all of it," Maya said. She didn't pull the trigger. She hit him with the butt of the gun, knocking him into the dark. "David, now!" They ran. They didn't look back. They burst through the far end of the tunnel, emerging onto a narrow ledge just as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the Cascades in a violent, bruised orange. Below them, the forest was alive. Dozens of lights, real lights, rescue lights, were swarming the trailhead. Maya looked at the sky. The black helicopter was gone, chased away by the rising sun and the arrival of the National Guard birds now screaming over the peaks. She sat down in the snow, her body finally giving up. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the microchip housing. She looked at it for a long time, then looked up at the clearing sky. "We did it, Miller," she whispered, her voice lost in the wind. "The silence is over." The world didn't end with a bang or a final bullet. It ended with the rhythmic thrum-thrum-thrum of a Black Hawk helicopter, a real one this time, bearing the insignia of the Washington National Guard. As Maya sat on the edge of the service road, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket that smelled of industrial detergent and hope, she watched the sun fully crest the peaks of the North Cascades. The mountains were no longer terrifying, they were just cold, indifferent giants once again. David was being loaded into an ambulance. He looked small, his face pale behind an oxygen mask. But he caught Maya's eye and gave a weak, trembling thumbs up. He had survived. The loose end had refused to fray. "Ranger Vance?" Maya looked up. A man in a dark tactical jacket with FBI emblazoned in yellow across the back stood over her. Behind him, Ben, her dispatcher, was wrapped in his own blanket, his face bruised but his eyes bright with tears of relief. "I'm Vance," she said, her voice a dry rasp. "I'm Special Agent Marcus Thorne. We received a high-priority emergency burst from this coordinate, followed by a recorded transmission from a ranger shoulder mic." He knelt in the snow, his expression grave. "You've caused quite a stir in D.C. this morning, Sergeant." Maya reached into her inner pocket. Her fingers were stiff, the skin cracked and blackened from the cold. But she pulled out the charred microchip housing, the physical serial numbers of the Aethelgard drive. "The Hades protocol," she said, dropping the metal into the agent's hand. "It's all in there. The targeting logs, the unauthorized AI iterations. Everything Miller died for." Thorne looked at the piece of wreckage as if it were a live grenade. "If this is what I think it is, Aethelgard Dynamics is going to have a very difficult morning at the SEC and the Department of Justice." "Good," Maya whispered. "Tell them it was a gift from Sergeant Miller." 3 months later, the courtroom in Seattle was sterile, smelling of lemon polish and expensive perfume. It was a world away from the pine-scented wind and the biting ice of Blackcap Mountain. Maya sat in the witness stand, wearing her dress green ranger uniform. Her left leg still ached when the weather turned, a permanent souvenir from the ice cave. But she sat straight. Across the room, Julian Vogel, the CEO of Aethelgard, sat behind a phalanx of $6,000 suit lawyers. He didn't look like a demon anymore, he looked like a tired, middle-aged man who had bet his soul on an algorithm and lost. The recording from Maya's shoulder mic played through the courtroom speakers. "I have the evidence, Miller. I finally got the evidence." The silence that followed the recording was heavier than any snowstorm. Maya didn't look at the jury. She didn't look at the cameras. She looked at a small, framed photograph sitting on the prosecution's table. A picture of a young soldier with a crooked grin and dust in his hair. When the verdict came down weeks later, conspiracy, corporate espionage, and second-degree murder charges for the cleaners, there was no cheering. Just a quiet sense of the scales finally leveling. Maya returned to the North Cascades on a Tuesday. The Blackcap Lookout was gone, replaced by a temporary steel platform while the Park Service debated rebuilding. The scars on the mountain were still there, the blackened patch where the plane had crashed, the splintered trees, but the forest was already beginning to heal. Ferns were pushing through the ash. She hiked to the high ridge where she had first smelled the kerosene. She wasn't carrying a gun this time. She carried a small, wooden box. She opened it, letting the wind catch the ashes inside. They swirled into the air, dancing in the light, becoming part of the mountain, part of the silence, part of the peace. "Rest easy, Miller," she said softly. "The truth is out." She turned back toward the trail. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a message from Ben back at the station. "Coffee's on, Maya. And David sent a crate of those fancy oranges from California. Get down here before I eat them all." Maya smiled. It was a small, genuine thing, the first one that had reached her eyes in years. She looked out over the vast, emerald expanse of her kingdom. She was 34 years old. She had been a soldier, a hunter, a witness, and a survivor. But as she began the long hike down, she realized she was finally something else. She was home. The mountains breathed, a slow, rhythmic pulse of life, and for the first time in a long time, Maya Vance breathed right along with them.